In this session, we're going to be hearing from some colleagues at the two research partners involved in the GrassCheckGB project. So they are scientists at AFBI, which is the Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute in Northern Ireland, and also from Rothamsted Research, and research based in their Northwick farm platform down in Devon. So we're going to be hearing from a couple of different speakers, but before we go into the presentations, just to run through a little bit of housekeeping for everybody. You'll notice that you've all come in and you've been automatically muted. We just want to keep any background noise to a minimum while everybody's speaking, but please do find and use the chat box to ask any questions at any stage of the presentations, and we'll be keeping an eye on that box and we can put your questions to the presenters when they're finished. Just to make you aware, this webinar is being recorded and the video will be available after the event. We'll be posting it onto the GrassCheckGB website. I appreciate with technology, there's always technical hitches. So if anyone is having a problem, the best approach is to try leaving and rejoining the meeting, as that usually sorts things out. Anything specific, you can pop us a message in the chat and we'll do our best to help you remotely if we can. Okay. Can I just introduce then to you our first speaker, which is Conor Holahan, who's my colleague here in AFBI in Northern Ireland. He is a grass and livestock research scientist, and he's going to speak to us about some of the work he's been doing on virtual fencing for grazing systems. Go ahead, Conor.
Thank you, Kat. I'll just get this up on my screen here now. You see that okay there, Kat? All good?
Yep, that's all good.
That's great. Yeah. So, hello everyone. My name is Conor Holahan, and as Kat was saying there, I'm a grassland and livestock scientist based in AFBI, Hillsborough, in Northern Ireland. And we've been running some research studies probably over the last 12 months or so on virtual fencing for grazing livestock. So I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes just talking through some of that. Some of you may have already come across virtual fencing before, some of you might not have. So I'm just going to give an overview of what exactly it is, and then some of the research that we're doing around that to try and establish some more knowledge on this practice. So we're all well aware of the traditional fencing methods, so that the likes of the barbed wire fencing, electric wire, stone walls in some cases, or even hedgerows and things like that to contain animals. But with the advent of technology and advancements in terms of GPS and satellite positioning, and also battery technology, the reality now is that we're able to fence grazing livestock without a physical barrier. So essentially that is what virtual fencing is. And the idea or the concept of this has been in development probably over the last 5-6 years, and really with those advancements in technology, those have come to fruition now in the last, as I say, probably in the last 12 to 18 months or so. So how the system works, there's two key components with these systems. So we have the GPS collar. Hopefully you can see my cursor on the screen here. So the animal wears a GPS enabled collar on its neck, and then we have the mobile phone app. So the farmer or the user is able to map where exactly they want to keep the animals, and then they can get some other data around GPS positioning and things like that, which I'll chat through in more detail. The virtual boundary itself, so this diagram will just gives you an overview of how the system works. So we have the animal here in the virtual pasture, and we have in red here the virtual boundary. So as the animal approaches the virtual boundary, the GPS collar starts to emit an audio warning. So that audio warning, as the animal progresses further across the virtual boundary line, it gets progressively louder. So it just goes beep, 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 beep. If the animal turns and returns back to the virtual pasture, that beeping stops. And if it continues on, the animal gets an electric pulse. So essentially, that's the pulse is the negative stimulus that deters the animal from going outside the allocated pasture. A very important aspect in this is the training of the animals. So essentially, we want the animals to learn how to use this system that we can then use the virtual fence in a number of different applications. So during the training phase, which lasts a minimum of 3 to 5 days, in some of our studies we've used up to 10 days, we use a single virtual fence line. So a relatively small paddock, a single virtual fence line is placed across it, and the animals are given time then themselves to learn how to use the system. So as I mentioned, it's based on associative learning, that where the animal hears the audio cue, it associates that with the potential of getting an electrical pulse. And in doing that, then the animals will learn to rely on or to respond to the audio cue alone. So that's kind of the basics of it. So once the training phase is complete, we then move into the post-training phase, or the operational phase, where you can then implement whatever kind of pasture, whatever shape of virtual boundary you want to use. So this is just a screenshot here of one of the paddocks at the farm at Hillsborough. So we've mapped out the square we want to keep the animals in. We then add the animals that we want to allocate to that particular grazing area, and then we move them then. So we move them into that area on the system, and when the animals physically enter that area, the collars will engage and the system activates then. There's other information as well, and I think as time goes on, there probably will be more capabilities with the virtual fencing system in terms of other types of information that we can get. But at the moment, so we can get things like in real time, the number of electric pulses that have been delivered to the animal, the number of audio warnings, and things like battery life, as well as the animal's exact GPS position. So that's the technology. What are the uses for it then? So there's a couple of different applications that in which virtual fencing could be useful to farmers. So in a lowland type system here, where we have pictured quite an intensive grazing setup, I've added in these yellow lines here to signify the virtual fence. Obviously, it's an invisible barrier in real life, but this is just sort of for informational purposes. So we can see here, it can be used where there's existing boundaries within the grazing area that you can subdivide pastures using the virtual fence. And there's other applications then in terms of upland type grazing scenarios where it's maybe not possible to physically fence off large areas, that grazing over expansive tracts of lands can be managed more efficiently. And then as well as that, we're able to track where those animals are when they are grazing such a large area. So as well as keeping animals in an area, there are other advantages in terms of keeping animals out of certain danger zones or certain environmental environmental areas that could potentially result in pollution or damage to habitats occurring. So things like ponds, river streams, swamps, and cliff edges, we're able to essentially create an invisible barrier there that the animals can't access those. So the benefits then, so obviously for the farmer, there's potential benefits there for improved management, monitoring, and animal performance. With the livestock and the animals themselves, we can potentially improve their safety and their welfare using these types of virtual fencing systems. And there's also potential benefits and quite a bit of interest in this at the moment around protecting sensitive habitats and the use of virtual fencing for conservation grazing management. The research then at AFBI, we really set out, obviously this is such a new technology, there was a couple of main concerns we wanted to address at the start, and I've highlighted those here. So that's number one is, does the system actually work? Does this technology work in Northern Ireland and UK farms? And also, what is the impact of that on animal welfare, if any? So that was obviously an important point as well, both from a public perception point of view and also from a researcher and from a farmer point of view. We wanted to know, does this impact the welfare of the animals? So we've quite a large team of researchers assembled that are working on this, and based at AFBI. We've also, the studies are funded through DAERA, so the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland, and through some European funding through the Super G project. So AFBI are leading the virtual fencing part of that study. So we've 3 or 4 other European partners that are also working on answering these key research questions that we have here. So study 1, which I'm just going to run through very briefly. I hope I'm doing okay for time. So we've done 2 studies essentially. We've done one looking at virtual fencing and compared that with electric fencing for animal welfare. And then we've done a second study just before Christmas looking at the use of virtual fencing for suckler beef cow systems. So I'm just going to briefly run down through these now. So this particular study, we used calves, so dairy beef cross calves. There was 64 calves used in total across 2 different treatments. So treatment 1 was virtual fencing, treatment 2 was electric. And it was conducted over 2 separate cohorts. Each cohort lasted 32 days. All these calves were naive to virtual and electric fencing, so that they'd never come in contact with either. And they were balanced for age, weight, gender, and breed. Some of the key metrics or key measurements that we were looking at in these studies then were number 1, cortisol, which is a stress hormone that is produced in animals. So that's one of the big gauges of how animal welfare is affected in this system. So we took hair and fecal cortisol measurements. We looked at activity data using ice cube or ice tag activity trackers on the animal's legs. We also looked at behavior observations through video recordings and live weight gain. So this is just a brief overview of the experimental period. I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but it just gives you a breakdown of the different phases of the experiment. So the pre-experiment, the training phase, and the implementation, which I'm just going to go through now. So the animals, they entered into so for each cohort, we had 4 groups of animals, as you can see here, and they were entered into their solid fenced enclosure for 5 days to acclimatize to the area. After that then, so on days 1 to 10 of the experiment, we introduced a single virtual and a single electric fence line. And they were allowed time then to acclimatize to that and to learn the system. After that then, we gradually increased the complexity of the system. So we went with a 3-sided virtual fence the animals were moved to, and then onto another 3-sided area. And then eventually, for the last number of days, then they were in a fully enclosed virtual and electric fenced areas. So this just shows you a picture of the field here. So we had the 4 different groups. So they started off in A, moved then to B, C, and then on to D. Some of the preliminary results, and I must emphasize that these are preliminary. We've only analysed the data for cohort 1. We're having some difficulties in terms of getting samples analysed and finding a lab to analyse them at the moment. So that's why these are just some early results, just to show you. So in terms of body weight for that first cohort of animals, we've seen that there was no significant difference between electric and virtually fenced animals in terms of the live weight gain. Looking then at activity, so we measured standing time, lying time, and number of steps per day. And again, we see no significant difference there between virtual and electric fenced animals. This graph here shows the pulses as a proportion of audio cues delivered during the experiment. And what it tells us is the degree of learning essentially among the animals. So during the first number of days, so particularly here on day 1, so for every what was I going to say there? Sorry. Yeah, so 20% of interactions with the fence or 20% of audio cues resulted in the animal receiving a pulse on the first day of the study. And as time went on, then this gradually dropped to the point where towards the end of the study we were working off around about 3 to 4% of audio cues resulting in a pulse. So it just gives an idea, I suppose, on the learning that has occurred there on the animals over time. We're seeing quite a variation between animals. So this chart here, we have the animals here. Each individual animal is represented by a bar. The blue line, or the blue part of the bar, is the audio cues, and the red part is the shocks. So we can see there's quite a large variation between animals in the number of audio cues that they're receiving, and some small variation in the number of pulses. But we can see here that there are some animals that are just, and this is something we need to look at further, is that they appear to be more curious and will test the system a lot more than certain others. So there's different personality traits, if you want to call it, between animals and that's something we'd like to look at further now in our analysis. We still are waiting on cortisol results and video recordings. We haven't completed those yet. In terms of cortisol, a couple of our other research partners in Germany and another research institute in Australia have looked at cortisol in similar studies as this, and they found no significant difference between electric and virtual fencing. So the preliminary findings so far would indicate that there is no welfare concern with the use of virtual fencing. Again, this needs to be verified over the next couple of weeks, hopefully. So I'm very briefly, Kat, I know I'm running a wee bit over time here. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of a suckler cow study that we done before Christmas, which was, we were trying to use virtual fencing as a means of creep grazing calves. So we had 24 beef cows and calves. We ran them for a 6-week study period. And I will just give you a couple of pictures and nothing, we haven't analysed a whole lot of that study just yet, but we had a 5-day training period for the animals, followed by an operation phase whereby we gave the calves an extra portion of grass in the paddock to graze ahead of the cows. And this photo here just gives us an idea. So these are all the calves out grazing in the creep graze area, and the cows then held back at the other side of the virtual line. And we were able to introduce concentrate feeding as well. So we were able to concentrate feed the calves just using a standard feeding trough ahead of the cows, and the virtual fence was successful in holding the cows back. So we can see that again here in this photo. Very briefly now, again, apologies, I'm running over time, but this here is just a brief video. Hopefully you can see it on your screens okay. And this is where we were feeding the concentrates to the calves. And we can just see, I'm fast forwarding it here slightly, we can see the cows being held back behind the virtual line here. We can see the virtual, the faint line in the grass here where the cows grazing line stopped. And we can see the calves coming along out into the creep area to eat their concentrate. So that's just a very brief overview. Apologies now I've ran over time, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Connor. Don't worry too much about the time. That's a really interesting presentation. Really glad to hear from you. A couple of questions just before I let you go, I suppose. Because you've talked about using this in upland systems and in terms of environmental protection, but also showing applications for creep feeding and more conventional grazing systems. Where do you see the biggest application of this technology going forwards, or is it everywhere?
Yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint one exact application that holds more promise than others. So far, there is quite a bit of research, or quite a bit of interest, I should say, around the conservation type grazing, because it opens up a whole different avenue where you can contain animals that just simply was not possible before. In the lowland type system, you're probably replacing electric fencing with virtual. So I suppose the upgrade is maybe slightly bigger, or the potential advantage is slightly larger for the conservation grazing type scenario. And part of our research is also going to look at the cost benefit analysis across different systems. So that will hopefully give us a better gauge of where the main benefits of this lay, and even comparing that across enterprises. So sheep farmers to dairy farmers, or what's the potential advantage there in terms of saving time and things like that with managing standard conventional fencing.
Great. Really comprehensive project. I'm glad to see the welfare aspect being looked at as well, because that's obviously talking point around this. I think you've probably answered the question coming from the audience. Have you got any plans to be testing on sheep? Sounds like you have.
Yeah. Our plan is over the next couple of weeks. We're hoping to begin a study on that, and yeah, we're interested to see how that pans out. So yeah, we've a couple of ideas there, and as I said, hopefully within the next 2 to 3 months, we should have some findings from that study.
Brilliant. Well, we will look forward to hearing those from you as well. Right, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So next up on our list of speakers today is my colleague, Dr. Debbie Mcconne. She's a dairy grassland researcher, again, based here in AFBI, and she's going to talk about some of the work that's been ongoing with combining robotic dairy systems and grazing activity.
Right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for that, Kat. So yeah, I wanted to take roughly about 10 minutes or so to outline some work we're doing with grazing and robotics and show you some initial work. What we wanted to do in this study was to look at the impact of partial grazing on the performance of dairy cows milked via a robotic milking system. Suppose just where we are in terms of robotics, well, looking at the Northern Ireland industry, certainly we've seen a big move towards robotics in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, as we have seen in other areas of the UK, and it's estimated now that over 10% of our national herd here in Northern Ireland is being milked via robotics, and there is the potential for that to continue to increase. We have a dairy industry structure quite similar to other countries which have had very good uptake of robotic milking systems, such as the likes of the Netherlands and Denmark. So it is something that, because of requirements for labour, certainly that it is an increasing milk yields and a bit of challenges towards access to land, it is something that is definitely taking or having an increased role to play in our Northern Ireland dairy industry. But the challenge that we've seen with robotics over the last number of years, and we did a study back in 2019 to interview robotic farmers about some of their management decisions and the transitioning process to robotics. And what we've seen from that study, and the big challenge, is that when we have installed robots here in Northern Ireland, primarily most of those robotics farms are then associated with see a change in the management of those animals during the summer period, pretty much away from grazed grass. So we are seeing herds that implement robotic systems really move to a full all year round house system, and so we're taking grazed grass out of the equation. If you look at the graph on the right hand side, you can see there, this is the proportion of farms that we asked and what their different forage offering was during the summer for cows, before, which is the bar on the left hand side, and after, which is the bar on the right hand side. And the bar on the left hand side, before they had installed robotics, about 62.5% of respondents grazed their primary group of cows during the summer, primarily full-time grazing. But after installation, you can see that green bar really dropping down quite significantly. So less than 10% of farmers then choosing to graze after installation of robotics. Now, some were offering grass an increased proportion actually through zero grazing in the diet, but in terms of grazed grass, that had fallen quite significantly. And I suppose, why is that a challenge? Well, obviously grazed grass is the cheapest feedstuff that is available to us here in the UK, and particularly in Northern Ireland is something that we do have an advantage to grow high volumes of grass, and obviously grazing is the cheapest mechanism by which we can choose to utilise that. So certainly when we're thinking about long-term profitability of farms, the more we can utilise grazed grass, certainly the lower we can reduce our feed costs. But as well as that, when we start to think about other pillars of sustainability, be that either environmental, so ammonia emissions, we know that if we can graze cows at pasture, that can reduce the ammonia emissions that are associated with housing cows. So if there's legislation that comes in from an ammonia perspective, and from a sort of public perspective, if people have concerns about cows inside all year round, so there might be a requirement for us to have cows out actively grazing in the future. And certainly, a number of our farmers mentioned this morning, it does a heart good to see some cows out grazing at grass. So it's something that I think we can all admit we do like to see. So what we wanted then to do is say, actually, in this scenario here, if we are moving mostly towards house systems, actually, is there a role for grazed grass? And what we really wanted to look at was in particular at sort of higher yielding cows and a robotic system which was operating higher yielding cows, because certainly that's what we've seen in Northern Ireland when we've installed robotics. We're seeing above average yields on the farms that are installing robotic milking systems compared to the national average. So it does seem to be tailored at that slightly higher yielding cow, and our yields are going up again and again. So our real aim of this study was to evaluate the impact of partial grazing access on the performance of dairy cows milked by our robot. So how did we design our study? Well, we had effectively on our robot, we had 48 spring calving dairy cows. 12 of those were first lactation animals, 36 of them were second lactation animals, and they were split into 2 groups, balanced for lactation, calving date, live weight, milk yield, body condition score, and genetics as well. And so these were fairly high yielding cows when they came onto the study. They were averaging just shy of 40 litres per cow per day. And we split those animals into 2 groups. One group where the 24 cows were kept inside full time. They were fed a TMR diet, sort of supplemented or formulated to offer maintenance plus 24 litres. And then they were fed to yield through the robot thereafter that. The second group were given daytime access to pasture, and they were housed at night. So they had TMR allocation at night. With that, we ended up putting a restriction on that, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. And then we offered them a 2-way grazing system during the day, so 2 different blocks during the day. So, and they were fed then to yield through the robot at about, again, at 0.45 kilos per litre of milk. So what would happen with our grazing group, which we had coloured them a yellow group in this scenario? So at 4 o'clock in the morning, the grazing gate would open for any animals that were in that yellow group, and they would be automatically shedded outside. We would come into the house then between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning, and if there were any cows that were overdue milking, we would put them through the robot. About 12 o'clock in the middle of the day, the second grazing block automatically opened up. So any cow that came back from the first grazing block would then be automatically shedded out to the second grazing block at 12 o'clock, after 12 o'clock. And then at 7, 8 o'clock at night, then we would bring in any remaining cows from the paddock. So effectively cows at a maximum could be out for effectively 15, 16 hours a day at the very maximum, but sort of at the very maximum duration. So they could still get a good proportion of their day out of grass. So this effectively was our Piccadilly Circus grazing shedding area. And what we can see here is we had a robot up, the purple was down in the purple area. We had a couple of different laneways, but we had effectively 2 blocks of grass which we could access. So during the morning, animals were given access to a paddock within block A, and during the afternoon, animals were given access to a paddock in block B. And so that was managed on a rotational grazing basis on a new fresh paddock effectively, or every single day. So what we measured were milk yield, fat and protein content of the milk, and animal live weight change. And then we looked at concentrate TMR and grass intake. And then we looked a little bit at grazing behavior, or milking behavior as well. So the milk interval and visit behavior, and then a wee bit at grazing efficiency and grazing parameters as well. So what we've seen really out of this, well, taking the grazing first up. So we had our morning paddocks, which is our block A, and our PM paddocks, which is block B. And so our pre-grazing covers, we were targeting around about 3,000 to 3,300 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. Our equation that we use here is slightly different in Northern Ireland, so that's generally our target. So we're hitting our pre-grazing covers okay. Our post-grazing covers, we were targeting between 15 and 1,800 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And you can see on average, we're in around 1,900 kilograms of dry matter per hectare on our post-grazing covers. We had a significant difference between the PM paddocks, and the PM paddocks were not grazed out as effectively as the morning paddocks. That led us to an overall utilization rate of about 78% in the morning paddocks, and a significantly lower quite a bit lower numerically anyway, 73% in the evening paddocks. All in all, when we looked at then total dry matter intake per cow, we were hoping to achieve in around 7 to 8 kilograms of dry matter intake per cow. In this study, we just achieved just shy of 5 kilograms of dry matter intake per cow between the 2 grazing events. But what we also noted quite significantly was that in the PM paddocks, we had less cows which actually made it to the afternoon paddocks. Some of those cows chose to stay in the morning paddocks, so that's why we ended up with poorer grass utilisation in the afternoon paddocks and a higher post-grazing cover there. So on average, we did see cows tend to come in from the grazing paddock quite a lot. So in the morning, we had an average of 1.6 or 1.7 visits per cow to the paddock. In the afternoon, it's about 1.4, but we did have significantly less cows visiting that afternoon paddock. And in total, those animals spent on average about 8.5 to 9 hours out of pasture throughout the day. So what we really see here was a grass intake of about 5 kilos a day, but there was certainly a preference for morning grazing, with some cows failing to move to the afternoon block. But in terms of visits, one of the, I suppose, critiques of grazing and incorporating robotics in grazing is actually that duration, or is that ability of grazing to get high milking frequencies, with some studies showing that as we incorporate grazing into the diet, milking frequency can drop quite significantly, with animals failing to come back to the robot. In this scenario, in this study, we didn't actually see that. We retained milking frequencies over 3 throughout the study with animals at pasture. So you can see actually our daytime milkings was as high from both our grazing cows and our grazing heifers as it was from our house cows and house heifers. There was no significant difference there. So those animals, when they were out at pasture during the day, still came and visited the robot quite a lot. And so now the one thing I would say about that is, why is that happening? We had our grazing paddocks in quite close proximity to the robot, so there wasn't a big trade-off there between animal walking back to the robot and then going back out again. There is some research to show that if you go further afield, sort of up to a kilometre away, that can significantly impact milking frequency and have a negative effect on it. But in this study, because we were quite close to it, we didn't see any negative effect on milking frequency. However, we did see quite a significant impact of introducing grazing on cow performance. In this scenario, we lost about 5 litres per cow per day throughout the summer months with the grazing cows compared to the housed animals. And that led to sort of, on average, over the sort of 100 days of the experiment, a reduction in total experimental yield by about 300 kilos per cow during that time. There was no significant differences in milk, fat or protein content, but those animals that were inside did have a significantly higher live weight gain, gaining on average about 27 kilos over the course of the study compared to those that were outside. And you can see then the difference in TMR intake here. We had animals in the house experiment eating somewhere in around 17 kilograms of TMR throughout the study, TMR dry matter, and of the grazing animals, they were eating on top of the grazing about 8 kilograms of TMR dry matter throughout the day as well, or throughout the nighttime period. So what we're seeing is reduced performance for the grazing cows, and we are still seeing them eating a reasonable amount of TMR, and we're seeing much better performance out of our house cows, much better, and obviously, but they are eating higher TMR to do that. So I suppose the question was then, is it actually worthwhile turning cows out to pasture if we are going to have to deal with that reduced performance? Well, what we found in total, when we looked at the diets, when we looked at concentrate intake, when we looked at that's in the robot and through the TMR, when we looked at silage intake and we looked at grass intake, and then we costed that out, what we found is that on average our house cows had a feed cost per day of about £5 per cow per day, and our grazing cows, because of that introduction of grass into the diet and a reduction in concentrate intake as well, only costs about £3.38 per cow per day to feed. The house cows did have a higher milk income, But overall, our margin over feed cost was slightly higher with our grazed cows. So over a 100-day period, that equated to about £26 per cow difference over a 100-day grazing period. So although initially when we look at the study, we see reduced performance from the grazing cows, what we do find is because we are introducing that lower cost feedstuff, we are seeing a financially better scenario with the grazed grass. So just really to sum up, from our study so far, what we've seen is we've got high milk and milk frequencies can still be obtained when cows are given daytime access to pasture. However, animal performance was reduced in this study, and that was really primarily due to obviously we're feeding grazed grass. It is a lower dry matter diet that we are feeding, and we went through a particularly wet period in the study. So on average, we were feeding grass of about 15-16% dry matter. That was compared to a TMR, which is a 38.5% dry matter in that TMR. It was good quality first cut silage. And also we forget that there's increased energy expenditure associated with grazing as well. So those animals were having to forage and work harder for every kilogram of dry matter that they did take into them. However, fairly acceptable levels of grass utilization could still be achieved. However, but cows did show a preference for morning grazing, so that has to be factored in when allocating grass. And overall, from an economic perspective, we were slightly better off with cows out of pasture. So even though we did see a reduction in animal performance, it's still financially we were better off with cows out of pasture. So I will finish there, Kat. Pass back to you if there are any questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Debbie. That was a really comprehensive presentation on some of that grazing and robotics work. We had a question come in from Nia, just asking, do you think long term you'd see a difference in lameness between the grazing and the housed cows? So particularly with reference to digital dermatitis or salt ulcers, is there going to be any difference between those treatments?
Hard to say because we didn't monitor in this study, and I think it depends on the management of the herds as well. I mean, digital dermatitis, if you haven't got it present in or sort of on the farm, it's not something that we have too much issue with here, so we didn't notice increased levels in the house cows. But that said, I think it's more about the management. What we actually did do in this study on a number of the laneways, and one of the things that we've been looking at in a wee bit more detail, is we installed AstroTurf on the laneways, and that has been certainly something that we've found to work quite well. And when we did a study that looked at cows' preference for AstroTurf, when we installed it, lame cows had a preference for walking on the AstroTurf compared to a stone dust laneway. So we're not saying it will reduce the incidence of lameness, but we know that cows that are lame do find it easier to walk on. So in that that I think has helped us maintain fairly good levels of hoof health in this as well, or at least ensure that cows traffic well, even if they do have any hoof issues as such.
Great, thank you. Just another question from Michael about fertility. Did you see any difference in pregnancy rate? And then did you say that there was 27 kilos more gain on the house cows in terms of live weight? I think that is.
Yeah.
So any comment on fertility?
So we worked with quite small groups. We only had 24 in each study here. So anecdotally, there didn't seem to be any difference, but it was quite a small number, so we didn't run any stats on it, but we didn't seem to see any difference, in the numbers. And in terms of the live weight gain, yeah, it was 27 kilos. That was over the course of the study, which is 100 days.
Thank you. Right. Thanks, Debbie.
Okay, thank you.
We, just in the interest of time, we'll keep motoring on. We're doing quite well at the moment. So our next presenter is Dr. David Patterson, who is a grassland agronomist here in AFBI, and he's going to speak about some of the research that's been going on with multi-species swards. I know there's a lot of interest in those within the GrassCheckGB project and within the wider industry at the moment, so I'm sure it'll be a very interesting presentation. That's your screen up now, David. Oh, I'm not sure we can hear you though. David, I don't think we've got your microphone.
Kat, I'm not hearing you. I can still see you. Just if you can indicate if you can see my screen and I am that you can hear me.
We can hear you now, David.
My screen has frozen at this end. Oh, it's very broken up for some reason.
The joys of technology. We can see David's presentation and we can hear him and he can't hear us.
Okay, a friend is telling me that I can be heard okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can see that first slide. What I want to do is basically take you through some of the studies that we're doing on multi-species swards here at AFBI. It's probably worthwhile just looking at that photograph in a wee bit of detail. You'll hear me talk today about biodiversity and species diversity and so on, but you can actually see it in that first photograph. Hopefully you can pick out the red clover plants. There are, I don't know how you can follow my cursor, but there are little flowers of chicory right there, the lilac blue color. There are dark colored spikes of plantain seed heads just there, but you can also see these broader lettuce leaf-like shapes are the chicory leaves, and the much more pointed spear-like leaves are the plantain herb components. So for those of you who have been brought up and raised on a diet of ryegrass, this is something quite different. Now, there may be some of you who have some experience already of multi-species swards, so this maybe is not quite as frightening to you as others. Okay, so just by way of ground, what are the potential benefits of multi-species swards? And you can see a whole shopping list in front of you there, from increased productivity, reduced use of nitrogen, and so on. But there's one or two I want to pick out. Yeah, improved availability of micronutrients, and that would imply there's something going on below ground in terms of mining and harvesting the micronutrients available in the soil. Improved soil quality and carbon sequestration. Again, another nod towards what's going on beneath the surface, alongside the other benefits of greater resilience and improved biodiversity and so on. So I just want to, the common denominator in all of that is the roots. And this was just a display that we set up recently for a local dairy event, and it just illustrates 4 or 5 of the main species, or the main rooting characteristics in the species that we're talking about in multi-species swards. The far left test tube you can see there is basically a second-year chicory plant, and you can see the very strong taproot, and about 5-6 inches long, with a lot of finer roots attached. The second tube across is a first-year chicory plant, and the point I'm trying to make there is the massive difference in terms of root development in 1 or 2 seasons of establishment in the same species. Third tube across is perennial ryegrass. No surprises there. Lots of top growth, but not so much in the way of below ground. Not so much in the way of below ground rooting. The fourth tube across is cocksfoot, and any of you who have ever tried to pull out a cocksfoot plant out of the ground will appreciate it's got a fair bit of resistance, and that is demonstrated there in the photograph, where you can see the sheer volume and mass and density of roots. And the 2 plants on the far right hand side are a juvenile and a mature plantain plant. You can see with the much more pointed leaf structure, and on the far right hand side the more mature plant, which has got a greater volume of roots. Not anywhere near as deep rooting as the chicory plants, but still a significantly high population of root volume below the surface. And there's some work done across the water in the Soil to Carbon project. A couple of centres involved there, but their preliminary findings, again thinking about the rooting theme. These deep roots can break up compacted soils, and as they grow and die and decay, they're contributing more and more carbon deeper down into the soil profile, where it can be safely stored into the carbon reserves and improving the overall soil organic matter. So there's a number of benefits there in terms of those roots and that different root architecture below the surface contributing to improved soil health. In terms of the research, what have we done so far in AFBI? There's been 2 literature reviews, one of which I'm still finishing off, called EcoSward. There are 2 grazing and a plot study on another site in AFBI, and there's an on-farms project involving 6 partner farms. In fact, the photograph on the left-hand side shows an excellent, very diverse multi-species sward with some pretty healthy-looking cattle on it as well. Some findings, I've just picked out 2 or 3 findings from the literature reviews that have been ongoing. And this is a very stylized curve, as you can see, but I think it brings out a few points from the literature very, very visibly. First of all, you can see the pattern of growth of each of the main species groups throughout the growing season, spring, summer, and autumn. And there's a lot of reference in the literature to the asynchrony of the temporal growth rhythms of the various species groups. And by that we mean that the peaks and troughs of grass and legume and herb don't all happen at the one time. And that's the strength, I think, coming from findings of others' research in terms of this ability to have some species that are dominant in the sward at different times of the season. And it has knock-on benefits, 2 of which I can bring to mind very quickly. One is the prospect of over-yielding, which you can get by combining a number of different species. And second of all, you don't get any of these gaps in productivity or gaps, physical gaps in the spatial distribution of the sward surface. So they're actually they're actually better in terms of preventing weed ingression. And there in particular, I'm thinking of docks and chickweed ingress into the sward. So there's a couple of benefits from that above ground species complementarity. Just swinging over towards the animal health side, just to draw your attention, this is a piece of research from the south of Ireland, and you can see in this bottom row of the table where they compared the total amount of anthelmintics used whenever sheep in this case were grazing multi-species swards. When they were grazing perennial ryegrass only, 2.7, perennial ryegrass white clover, 2.1, and again significantly lower again, the 6 species multi-species sward had the lowest amount of treatments being administered to the sheep as a result of grazing multi-species swards with 6 species present. Continuing on with the animal health story, other findings from the literature, the herbs, for example, have been shown to be highest in terms of their tissue content of mineral, highest for iodine and selenium. The chicory had higher levels of calcium and copper. And again, the common denominator is this better rooting system, able to draw up minerals from deeper down in the soil and translate that into the tissue or the material available for grazing. The next question is whether those elevated levels of minerals translate into the animal, and we've got some results coming up on that shortly. And the third step would be to see whether if there's any trace of higher levels of minerals ending up in any of the product, be it the milk or the meat, and that's a future research question. So just to briefly summarize some of the conclusions from the couple of literature reviews so far, the benefits are listed there for you, but essentially there's the opportunity to use lower amounts of artificial nitrogen fertilizer, with the consequent reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. And that's all particularly topical these days from a financial point of view and from an environmental point of view. Greater resilience, greater soil structure and soil health. Yeah, and great performance in lambs, maybe less so, less obvious differences in cattle systems so far. There's the potential for improved mineral uptake at least into the tissue of the plants at this stage has been shown, and a consequent reduction in the need for anthelmintics. Again, there's a number of sheep studies that have shown that, but there are challenges. There are knowledge gaps. There's lots of things that we don't understand about these swards. And just to crudely summarize those, there's a whole different sward management required to successfully achieve the benefits that we've highlighted there. And one particular weakest link, maybe you want to call it, is the persistency of some of the herb species. I'm thinking about chicory in particular. What we have found across our research trials and our on-farms partner project is that chicory is probably the least persistent herb, and yet it's got probably some of the highest values in terms of the contribution to the multi-species sward. So getting back to some of our trials very quickly, you can see the plot trial on the left and the grazing study on the right. This plot trial on the left-hand side, what we've set up there are plots of pure monocultures. And what we're saying there is we've taken a multi-species sward mixture, grow the mixture in plots and grow the components out separately in plots as well. The Holahan harvester is just sitting there out of interest in front of a plot of pure plantain, which has probably been the strongest herb and the most persistent herb that we've come across so far. On the right hand side, you can see our grazing study back at AFB Hillsborough, and essentially we've allocated dairy origin beef cattle to either a grass clover sward or exclusively to a multi-species sward and grazed throughout rotational grazing throughout the summer over the last 2 years. From the plot study, just a quick reference to some of the results. I referred earlier to over yielding, where basically the yield of the total is greater than the sum of the parts, and that has been borne out in this particular graph. You can see the mixture is called no grass at the far left. And this is basically a mixture of all of these components. There's red clover, white clover, plantain, and chicory, all in the no grass mixture. But when we looked at the yield of that, these are results from 2021, when we looked at the yield of that, it was significantly higher than all of the individual components. Well, the majority, I should say. I think it wasn't quite significantly higher than the red clover component of that one variety of red clover. But the majority of the components of the mixture, when they're combined together and grown together, you get an over yielding effect, which was what was referred to in the literature, and now we've actually backed that up in the plot study. And the same general effect was picked up when we looked at grass mix, which is an interesting mixture. It's a grass clover mixed essentially, but it's not just ryegrass. There's timothy, cocksfoot, tall fescue, as well as ryegrass present alongside the white clover. And in this case as well, there was over yielding demonstrated very neatly, where the grass mix, when all those components are brought together, out yielded all of the individual monocultures when separately grown out in the plot study. So the findings from that, legume herb and grass legume mixtures seem to out yield their component monocultures. And I think it also suggests, the data also suggests that the functional group composition is more important than the number of species present, because you can see in that second graph very easily that you had a number of different grass species present, but unless they are very contrasting in terms of their growth habit and their temporal growth rhythm throughout the season, you don't get as much of a benefit whenever you bring those huge number of species together. But it's better to have a mixture with contrasting species present. In terms of the grazing study, just very quickly, some results there. The fundamental comparison was grazing, as I said earlier, 2 groups of cattle on 2 different mixtures. The mixture on the left is mixture A, which is a fairly conventional ryegrass clover mixture. Mixture B on the right-hand side simply had some plantain and some commander chicory substituted in for a portion of the ryegrass clover. But in terms of animal performance, over 2 years so far, you can see here the live weight gain performance figures for those dairy origin beef steers over 2020 season and 2021, and there was no significant differences in terms of performance on either the grass clover or the multi-species swards. But aside from outright gain, in terms of animal health, what was interesting was that we picked up lower egg counts when we looked at the mixture B component, and you can see here even there's August 21, for example, 108 in the grass clover fed animals, with only half of that roughly in the animals fed grazing on the multi-species sward. When we looked over, we mentioned earlier about trace elements in the herb in the sward tissue. In the trace elements of the blood samples taken from the cattle, no difference is showing up. Okay, as yet. That was taken for copper and selenium. Where we did pick up some significant differences was underneath. You heard me talk a lot earlier about the rooting differences. Well, as a consequence of that, perhaps there are different populations of earthworm and their activities underneath these swards. The photograph, or the tray on the left, is a photograph of earthworm samples underneath a grass sward, and the one on the right is underneath a multi-species sward. Not only are there a greater number of earthworms under it, there are a greater number of these stronger, fatter, burrowing earthworms called anisic category. And you'll see Chris Boughton, the Queen's student who did this work, has produced some lovely graphs here. And you can see here in terms of the total number of earthworms underneath these swards, significantly higher amounts of numbers of earthworms under the 6 species sward, which is 2 clovers, 2 grasses, ryegrass and timothy, and 2 herbs, chicory and plantain, and significantly higher than a perennial ryegrass only soil, and under a permanent pasture and 4th there, sorry, I just lost my cursor, and under the reseed was the lowest of all. No surprises there. And within those larger numbers, the anisic proportion of worms, which are the ones that do the deep burrowing down into the lower levels of the soil, again, significantly higher proportion of those very useful worms in the population under the multi-species swards. So a very strong, significant result just there. Leaving aside the research trials on the AFBI sites, there's been a very useful project, the European Innovation Partnership Project with beef and sheep farmers, 6 or 7 farmers who've been basically trying out these multi-species swards. And what they did was they planted in 2 adjacent fields, either a grass clover mix on one side and a grass clover herb mix on the other. And we did some comparisons on the performance of their swards. And you can see here for last season, just if we focus on this last column here, the percentage difference in yield, the multi-species sward versus the control, which was grass clover. And you can see in all but one of those sites, there was a gain, a positive gain for the multi-species swards productivity. And they were all managed broadly similarly, except on one site. So overall, the herbal lay side yielded 7% more herbage than the grass clover side, with 11% less nitrogen fertilizer. So very good backup information coming through there from the farms, which cover different types of farm setups, different approaches, different soil types, and different geographical regions. And some of the same broad trends are coming through, which is very encouraging. Also looked at the minerals that were in the herbage tissue samples on those same farms, and again the multi-species sward samples were higher in most of the main minerals compared to the grass clover fields sitting alongside, so higher in things like calcium and iron and so on. So the preliminary conclusions that we're drawing from the literature reviews, from the initial preliminary findings from our own platform studies, as well as the on-farm feedback, is that these multi-species swards can produce comparable yields to what are otherwise very productive grass clover swards. And there is also the opportunity to reduce chemical fertilizer use from an environmental point of view and economic. The multi-species swards can maintain or enhance animal performance relative to grass clover. Certainly from the literature, that's especially true for sheep systems. Multi-species swards appear to reduce worm burdens in livestock, and we've seen some evidence of that in our own trial, and reduce the anthelmintic use, and plenty of literature covering that as well. And finally, again, from our own findings there, promoting the swards will promote the populations of these deep burrowing earthworms, which has really good effects in terms of water infiltration and soil aeration, and basically means you've got a more resilient, not just a resilient soil, but a more resilient grassland system, which can maybe survive some more of the shocks of either flooding or drought, for that matter. And I know I'm running short of time, but I'll just sort of leave that list with you. You can see there at a glance between the existing and the new projects that are coming up. We have multi-species sward trials about to happen there on sheep, and about to happen with dairy cows, existing one with beef cattle. There's a new one coming up looking at emissions with zero grazed multi-species sward. There's a long-term ongoing nutrient study now with multi-species versus grass, looking at the carbon storage beneath the surface. Our plot study will continue, as will the on-farm study that we referred to. Just been a very quick overview, but especially coming through from the farmers involved in the EIP project, there's some very urgent, I suppose, practical challenges that we need to address. For example, which establishment method works best in certain conditions. Others there listed would be to do with seed mixtures and which species to include. Early management of the swards are critical. How to maintain herbs in the multi-species, which is a nod to that persistency problem of certain species. And then when you get into the hardcore management of it, you know, what are the best target sward heights if you're in a rotational system, the entry and exit heights, and do those change throughout the season, when to close up in autumn, etc., etc. So there's lots of practical answers required before we can go to the broader industry and present a sort of a management blueprint. We're still some way off that at the moment, but between the research on farm and the research on our platforms, I think we can get to that. I'll maybe stop there, Kat, if that's okay.
Brilliant, thank you, David. Can you hear me now?
It's very broken up. I'll try my best. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's a question coming from Sarah, which you should be able to see in the chat. I don't know if you want to tackle that one. Just asking about the grazing residuals that were achieved in the study, looking at fecal egg counts and worm burdens between the different sward types. So is there going to have been any influence of the sward management on the fecal egg counts, or is it purely to do with the sort of anthelmintic benefits of the sward species?
Yeah, the residual sward heights, we tried to keep those as similar as possible across both the grass clover and the multi-species plots. Now it's not going to be identical, but our target sward heights, and we got pretty close to those target residual sward heights, were similar. So I don't see that being something that would necessarily explain the differences in the egg counts. Basically the animals were grazing, give or take, as close in both sward types.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And in terms of sort of the practical uses, and I know there's a lot of work left to be done, but there's so much interest in this space at the moment, sort of on farm. If you're a farmer and you're thinking you want to be putting multi-species in, so where do you start in terms of choosing what mixture and how many species would be your first step into doing that?
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose if I look across our on-farm study, and there was quite a range of different species and mixtures that the farmers have since used. And thinking back to the literature reviews and all of the different mixtures that we came across there, and from our own experience, I think I would plump somewhere in the middle, which is the 6 species mixture. Interestingly, it's the one that we have adopted and put into the new platform for the sheep study, which is red clover and white clover, one variety of each. Ryegrass and timothy, one variety of each. And chicory and plantain, one variety of each. So it goes back to that point that I made, I hope, earlier on, that the over yielding, which is one of the things we're trying to achieve, is getting that extra sward performance by combining different species. I don't think there's much point having 5 or 6 varieties of each species. Keep it relatively simple, 1, maximum 2 varieties, but have those 6 species present in the sward to make sure that we get all of that complementarity of growth rhythms throughout the season, and so that the maximums and the minimums all don't happen at the one time.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that presentation, David. Really appreciate it. It's some very interesting research coming out in this space at the moment, and certainly more to follow as well by the looks of it. I think if Suzanne,
lots to do. There's lots still to be done. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm hoping that Suzanne is with us, and hi Suzanne. So if you want to get your screen up, our next speaker is going to be Suzanne Higgins, and she is a soil scientist working in the agri-environment research branch of AFBI. Again, a speaker based in Northern Ireland. Suzanne's expertise is in soil science and nutrient management, so I think you're going to give us a little bit of an update on some of the research activity. Is that?
Yes, it won't let me share my screen at the moment.
If you want to fire your presentation over to me, I will do my best. We can do next slide, please. The 2020.
Okay, I'll have to, yeah, because it won't let me share here.
You've got to 11 online.
Here, hold on. Yes, that's okay. I can get it now. Just let me know when you can see that.
Yeah, all good.
Is that okay? Afternoon, everybody. So I'm Suzanne Higgins. I'm a soil scientist at AFBI. So I'm going to talk this afternoon about some of the soil nutrient management research that we do in the agri-environment branch. So the key focus of our work is to, in soil nutrient management, is to look at things like improving nutrient management on farms, and this is affected by things like farm management intensity. And one of our primary goals is to minimize the loss of valuable nutrients to the environment. And we also want to increase the efficiency of nutrient use and the precision of nutrient use on farms. So one of our key focus things that we focus on is know what nutrients are needed and where, and also to look at the timing of the applications, because these are some of the key things that improve nutrient use efficiency. So one of the things the most important thing is soil sampling. And we really emphasize to farmers the importance of soil sampling their fields every 4 to 5 years and measuring the key nutrients. So we look at phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, soil pH, and we're just about to embark on a huge soil sampling scheme across Northern Ireland, where every field in Northern Ireland is going to be sampled, and farmers are going to receive a nutrient management plan specific to their farm. So this is a really exciting new project that's about to start, and it'll be over the next 4 or 5 years. And one of the most important things when soil sampling is to take a representative sample per field. So there's actually a lot of nutrient variation at a subfield scale. So unless you take a representative sample, you're not going to get an accurate measure of the nutrients in that field. And each farmer, we tend to produce nutrient management plans for a farm, because a farmer can, they have a good response. Oh, can you hear me?
We can hear you, but your slides aren't moving on. I did drop you a message.
Moving on for me.
We're not in the slideshow view. We've just got the PowerPoint view.
Okay, sorry. Okay, you're not seeing what I'm seeing then. I'll have to stop sharing. I'll try sharing again.
Sorry.
It's totally different from what you're saying. Can you see that now?
It's not sharing just yet, but we'll give it.
Okay, let me see. Share. Okay, so let me know what you can see.
So that's on slide 4 with the soil sampling.
Okay, so I'll try moving on from here, and let me know if you can see. Has it moved on? No. Yeah, because I'm moving on slides, but you obviously aren't seeing them. So what do you want me to do?
It's not moved now, no.
Okay, well, what do you want me to do then?
Do you want to just email your presentation over to me for a moment? We can take just a pause for a second. I mean, I think we have Andy Jones with us from Rothamsted. I can see. I don't know, Andy, if you want to, if you're ready to start presenting, and we can come back to Suzanne in a minute.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm ready to
go. We'll cross our fingers for the technology to play ball. So nice to meet you virtually, Andy, because we are in very different places at the moment. Andy is a researcher based over in Rothamsted Research. I'll maybe let you give yourself a bit more of an introduction, and if you want to get sharing.
Yeah, no problem. I can't promise that my technology will work any better, but we can give it a go. Okie dokie. So if I share my screen, then if I do this, can you see my title slide?
We can, yes.
You can? Excellent. Okay, yeah, so good afternoon then, everybody who's joined us today. I believe I probably met some of you when I was going around doing some soil sampling, but if I haven't, then hello. My name is Andy Jones. As previously mentioned, I'm based in Rothamsted Research, and my work predominantly deals with the use of information gathered on farm, and specifically looking at what information you should be recording. Okay, did my slide change there? Hello? Okay, I'll go on the assumption that my slide did change. Okay, yeah, so today I wanted to talk about a study I conducted last year, which, as it says at the top there, I was looking at ranking metrics.
That's changed, Andy.
It has, thank you very much. Looking at ranking metrics for sheep production systems based on the economic value of the information. So just very briefly, I just want to mention the Northwick farm platform, which is the main experiment going on at Rothamsted Research at the Northwick site. It's a long-term experiment. It's been going on for about 10 years now, and involves 3 small individual farms known as farmlets, each of which has its own little herd of cattle and its own flock of sheep. The reason why I mention that is because the Northwick Farm platform is known as the most highly instrumented research farm in the world. And because of this, we've got a huge amount of data that we've collected, which I've used essentially as a data mine for the purposes of this study. Okay, so on to the study. As you can see from the table on the right, this is a list of some of the key performance indicators used on sheep farms currently in circulation. And this list was pretty much directly taken off the HTB website. And as you can see, there's quite a long list of different metrics available, but there's not a huge amount of guidance around exactly which ones you should be using, and indeed how many of them you should be using. So the first step of this study was to try and kind of clarify what exactly the purpose of each performance metric is. And to do this, we defined 3 different terms, and these are predictor, outcome, and descriptor. So predictor, as it sounds, this is not directly aligned to a performance output, but it is a good way of estimating what that may be. So if we take birth weight, for example, birth weight itself doesn't make you any money, but it is strongly linked to a lamb's growth rate and subsequent finishing age, and that itself is linked to your production costs, so it is directly linked to an output. The next one along is outcome. So as it sounds, that is directly aligned to an output. So again, as I mentioned before, the slaughter age, that's directly linked to how much it costs you to produce a lamb, and therefore that is directly aligned with a production output. And the final one there, descriptor, it's not strictly speaking a performance indicator, and that's because this is something that you directly determine yourself. So if we take ewe to ram ratio, for example, that's a decision that you've made, and therefore it's not necessarily an output or a component of the system. It's more of a rule that you work within. So for the purposes of this study, we're essentially looking at the link between performance predictors and performance outcomes. So once we've defined what the purpose of each metric is, the next step was to try and find a mechanism for comparing them all objectively in a way that is kind of fair. And the way that we did that was, as I mentioned, look at the link between a performance predictor and a performance outcome. If we take lamb birth weight, for example, as a performance predictor, and the subsequent slaughter age as the outcome, we're essentially looking at the link between the two. So step 1 was to order lambs according to their birth weight. So using the data set that we had from Northwick, we had a range between 2.2 to 8.5 kilograms in lamb birth weight. Order lambs according to that, and then allocate them into one of 3 groups: low, mid, and high performing groups. Next is we calculate the average outcome variable for each of these groups, and then we find the difference between the low and the high performing groups. So to put this another way, if we were able to intervene at the point of the predictor variable and move an animal from a low performing group into a high performing group, what would be the benefit of doing so? And in this particular example, if you moved a low performing group to a low performing lamb to a high performing lamb, that would be a saving in nearly 40 days in slaughter age, so birth to slaughter days. Okay, so that's the mechanism. So the next step was to apply this across 10 different predictors and a couple of different outcomes there. So we use 10 lamb growth level predictors and 2 different outcome variables there. So as we saw from the previous slide, this is the link between birth weight and the slaughter age, and the association between the predictors and the outcomes is shaded according to the strength of positive association. So the darker the color, the better it is, essentially. If we look across to carcass value, the single most valuable performance predictor there was actually the ewes weight at lambing, with a difference £3.34 between high and low performing groups. But if we look a bit further down the table, weaning weight was also very strong, £2.20, but crucially it showed the greatest saving in the slaughter age between birth and slaughter. Now, particularly the carcass value here, this could be explained by something which we've investigated in a previous study, which is a study which essentially looked at the link between a lamb's weight at weaning and their subsequent carcass quality. Basically, what we found was if lambs are heavier when they're weaned at 13 weeks, then they're more likely to have better carcass composition, better carcass conformation, and also to have leaner carcasses, which we managed to publish a paper on, and we also got it into Farmers Weekly as well. Yeah, so that could potentially explain why we're seeing weaning weight as being such a valuable metric. Okay, so that's just looking at predictors in isolation so far, so independently. However, it's probably unlikely that you'll only measure and monitor one thing on the farm. So this next step of this study was to look at these different metrics in combination. So just to explain this graphic briefly for you. So along the bottom, that's the number of different metrics drawn from our list of 10 from the previous slides. And up the left-hand side, that's the benefit in pounds, which is lamb carcass value. The actual series on the plot itself, the circle ones, is the best combination of metrics from that number. So the best 2, the best 3, so on. Triangles, average, and crosses are the worst. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that this graphic kind of points out. Firstly, is if you have a look at the red arrow there, if you're only picking 2 metrics, the difference between the worst 2 and the best 2 is quite substantial. So that's about, what's that, around £2.50 difference. So if you're going to record things on farm, and you're only going to record a small number of things, you should be very careful about what you use to justify which metrics that you use. Next thing this graphic can identify is, if you have a look at the red circle there, that was when peak information value was realized. And what this means is that after this point, so if you used 5, 6, 7 metrics and so on, there was actually lower information value. So essentially the value of collecting information was diluted. So this kind of points out that there's very much a sweet spot when it comes to gathering information. You should gather a certain amount, but not too much, because it just starts to muddy the water a bit. Okay, so this kind of is very useful. It shows how much information we should be gathering, but it doesn't point out which ones are the useful ones. So as a logical evolution on to the next stage of this study, this table here is a bit daunting, I suppose, but it tries to highlight which ones the good metrics are. So the shaded columns is the number of different metrics, and the 3 columns within those shaded columns are the best, second best, and third best combination of that number of metrics. So as you can see from this, the 2 best ones were the used body condition score and weight at lambing. Now this is, well, maybe not unsurprising, but it's quite logical how this is the case. So if you use them in better condition at lambing, they're going to have more energy reserves, and they're going to raise you better lambs, which are therefore going to grow faster and be more valuable. However, the least valuable ones were the used body condition score and weight at weaning. And the reason for this is a bit less obvious to determine, but we've kind of thought this is more related to the variation in the amount of I suppose, body reserves that a ewe needs to mobilize during the lactation period. So you can have 2 ewes which both raise a very good lamb, but one of them has taken a lot more off the back than the other one. And because of this variation, it means that this is a less valuable metric over the whole flock because of this variation. Okay, so I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to quickly whip through the last couple of slides. And this is just a bit of an exercise we did, trying to look at back calculating this information to try and define some actionable benchmarks. So what we did here was essentially we took the metric the method I explained to you before about dividing animals by a predictor variable. But instead of dividing them by thirds, in this scenario, we divided them in half, and we changed where we split them. So if you see the highlighted line there, in this scenario, we split them by use weight at lambing of 84 kilograms. So top is above that, bottom group is below that, to try and find out what's the difference in lamb carcass value between these two groups. The main purpose of this exercise, the main thing that came out of it, is that you need to be careful where you apply these interventions, because it can be financially untenable. So if we take at the final column there, even though the difference is greatest for that highlighted row, you'd have to apply an intervention to 85% of your flock in order for it to have a difference. So if we look at this graphically, that's the same again. So if we intervene at 84 kilograms to try and get everything to 84 kilograms and above, we'd have to intervene around 85% of the flock would have to have an intervention in place there. So yeah, just to bear in mind that when you're applying interventions, think about how many animals you have to apply the intervention to, and whether or not the cost would therefore outweigh the benefit. Okay, so thanks very much for listening to my talk today. Happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Andy. That was great. Sounds like there's an awful lot that can be done with all of the data that people can be recording on their farms, but quite challenging to know exactly what to do with it. I don't know if you have any sort of key starting points for somebody that wants to make a start on doing this kind of work with their own flock. Like, what would be your first suggestion for where they go to look?
Sorry, can you say that one again? You're breaking up a little bit. I didn't catch the last bit there.
Technology today. There's such a volume of data, and it looks like it's quite finely balanced in terms of picking the right metrics to be looking at. What would be your take home for somebody to, you know, where do they start with looking to benchmark in this area?
It depends very much who I'm speaking to. I think I know there's a lot of producers out there who already have got a good understanding of their system and the processes that work within it. If you're literally starting absolutely from scratch and you've not recorded anything before, then yeah, I'd say record more to start with, just to get an understanding of the processes that occur and where you're making and losing money on the farm. Once you get an idea of that, you start to kind of hone in on which particular components of your system need improvement. Yeah, you can kind of narrow in from there. So yeah, to some farmers, I'd say just start recording something, just make a start, you know. But other farmers who are much better, yeah, just kind of try and hone in on which particular components of your flock make you money and which ones don't. And be, you know, you might need to be a bit brutal with it, but yeah, just really kind of be quite clinical with where you need to trim the fat, I suppose.
I mean, that ties in quite nicely with everything that we were saying in the morning session about grass and how important it is just to be measuring and just to be identifying what is going on. And reminds me of a quote from one of our GrassCheckGB farmers. I won't name him, I'm not sure if he's on the call, but I'm hoping you wouldn't mind. He's a sheep farmer and he views his grassland recording as being performance recorded grass with performance recorded lambs. And I think that's really the way to go. I imagine you'd not argue with that, Andy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in order to understand where you need to intervene, where you need to make changes, you need to know what's going on first. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. I will let you off the hook, and I think we're moving on. So I've spoken to Suzanne. Technology just isn't quite playing ball with us today, so hopefully we'll get some updates from her that we can share on the website in a separate recording or in a separate media. But if we move on now to our final presenter for the afternoon, which should be Dr. Tara Takahashi. Are you with us, Tara? You are.
Yep. Thank you, Kat. Sorry, I was a bit relaxed because I thought that then I'll be second one, but that's all right.
That's okay. We're keeping nicely to time now, so no need to panic.
Are you seeing that now?
Yep, that's come up.
Yeah, brilliant. Good afternoon, and nice to see you all again. So to wrap up today's conference, I'd like to talk a little bit about the slightly lighter, maybe hearted, or the higher level talk of about the role of livestock farming and the sustainability. So this is the compilation of the latest research from Robotics Research, and this work is very much hands-on in terms of how to measure what matters to the interventions. And here we are talking more about the higher level policy indication. And the title is The Impact of Livestock Manure on Arable Soils, and I'll cover slightly more over the next 10 minutes or so. So earlier, a few years ago, we found that the level of soil organic carbon on the grazing paddock have got the positive correlation with the animals' performance on that particular paddock. And this is the case for the beef and sheep farm, but we are collecting data for dairy as well to see whether the results can be translated into that right now. In any case, what we found here was that when we have got the healthier soil, then that leads to better live weight gain, partly because the grass performance is better, and also because you could hold more water through the soil organic carbon, and therefore you lose less of the nutrients from that particular field. And so that was the starting point of our recent research. And okay, so the healthy soil is important. Now, what else can we learn from this finding? You think about this, and when you see the map of the UK, then of course there are arable in the east and the grassland in the west right now. But you think about the history of the UK and the land use. If you go back to say up to 500 years, probably there is no single piece of land whereby an animal has never been on it. So that means that then when you think about the land use change from here onwards, there are two quite interesting questions. One is that if we are to change our dietary style and then reduce livestock, can the current grassland be effectively used for arable production? And this is a quite interesting question, because just because it's grassland now doesn't mean that you can never do it. But also at the same time, we are all choosing to use land as grassland. So maybe there's a good reason for it, which is more true. The second question is that if we completely withdraw livestock from the arable farming systems, then can arable farming systems still sustain over many centuries to come? Again, as I said, and there are no piece of land where animals have never been on it. Therefore, every single soil fertility right now is the product of the livestock manure and also the manure from the wild animals. So if we create a very artificial situation whereby those animals are never coming back, then what will happen to the arable land and then its fertility? That's also an interesting question to ask. To answer the first question, what will happen if we convert our land from grassland to arable? You may have heard of our trial at the Northwick farm platform, whereby we converted one of the 4 farms into the purely plant-based systems. So what we do here is that we compare the grass productivity versus the crop, human edible crop productivity, alongside the environment, welfare, ecological, and the economic variables. And on the arable side of the trial, we assume the world without livestock. So in this world without livestock, we don't apply any manure. We apply synthetic fertilizers, but no manure, because we assume no livestock. We don't use any feed crops as part of rotation. For example, we don't use barley, we don't use lucerne, and so on, because there is no animal to feed in this hypothetical world. We don't wear a jumper on this farm because there's no sheep in this world. and we don't wear boots on this farm because there is no cattle skin in this world. The last two are light-hearted remarks, but this is the level of the drastic nature of the transition we are thinking about. And then we want to back calculate where can we find the sweet spot in terms of the optimal and the most sustainable land use. This is the video from one of the stormy day, and then the amount of soil we are losing from our arable field. So once you convert permanent pasture into arable land, especially on the undulating topography of the southwest, sometimes the unintended consequences in terms of the soil erosion, in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions and so on could be quite large. This was the video taken in 2019 during the one stormy event, and 3 minutes apart we took this video from the permanent pasture only 300 years away. So you can see the clear difference in the turbidity of the water, and therefore the amount of soils, amount of nutrients we are losing there. And interestingly, the amount of water we are losing is different as well, because when you have got permanent pasture, then you have got the higher level of soil organic carbon there, and therefore you can hold more water, therefore you lose less water. Overall, on this particular storm event, we lost about 7 times more soil from the arable land than from the permanent pasture. So you never know, if you convert your land to arable to become more sustainable and through mixed farming rather than specialist and livestock farming, then there is a chance that you may actually have nothing to produce on to begin with. So we have to be very careful about balancing these pros and cons of what is perceived to be short-term sustainability. That was one of our findings. More recently, we use these data and they simulated what would happen if we tax against the livestock production, especially the ruminant productions. And across the UK, what we found was that by taxing against the ruminant production systems, we can reduce CO2 emissions from the country. And we are confident about that finding. But at the same time, we will lose a very large amount of the equivalent valuation, which is the indicator of the economic welfare in the macroeconomics. And more importantly, we found that this economic loss or losses from society may actually be bigger, up to 2.5 times bigger compared to the monetized benefit of the greenhouse gas saving. Now, the monetization of greenhouse gas is a very difficult topic because some people argue that you have to stop greenhouse gas emissions at any cost. In that case, this monetary comparison doesn't make any difference because you have to just stop it. But if you have got the more moderate approach of balancing them together so that we could find the sweet spot to best find the best and happiest medium, then our data indicate that if you try to reduce livestock population too much, then not only the farmers, but also the society on the whole would suffer. This is because the livestock industry is not independent of everything else. It's all interlinked. For example, the southwestern economy is reliant on farmers who are served and who serve other businesses. And then therefore, all these repercussions have to be considered, and that also included in this calculation. Now, the second question I mentioned in terms of the optimal land use was, would the arable land be okay if we withdraw livestock? And then to analyze that, we went back to our broad bulk arable trial at the Rosamsted Harpenden. This is our arable arm. Here we have been running the same trial over the last 178 years, and we have been monitoring the change in soil health under different farming systems. So using that, the results I'm going to show you now compares the soil fertility level, crop production level, and also the greenhouse gas emission, and from the plots that have never ever received any fertilizer, meaning that over the last 180 years, you have just been mining nutrients from the soil with no input whatsoever, except for the natural deposition from the atmosphere and the rain. And we also have got the other plots with the organic fertilizer only, cattle manure only, and the mixture of both. And when you compare the different inorganic systems at the different intensities, what you are seeing here is the breakdown or the proportion of the nitrogen put into the system that were used for the crops or the harvest, that's today, and then that gets stored in the soil, that's tomorrow, and then that gets lost forever. That's the lost in the gray shaded area. Loss means that those nitrogen went to either the atmosphere or to the water systems in the form of, for example, nitrogen gas, ammonia, nitrous oxide, and the nitrate, many other forms. But either way, basically, they are used for nothing in terms of agricultural production. On the other hand, the amount that was stored in the soil, yes, you could not use that for this year's production, but there is still a chance that that gets used in the next year. So, and these two should be separated when you interpret these data. And what you are seeing here is a slope here that when you put more nitrogen into the system, then that results in greater proportion of losses, and therefore only a smaller proportion gets used for the crops in the big scheme of things. In terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, one of the important indicators is the amount of nitrate leached into the water systems, because those nitrates eventually become the nitrous oxide, not in full, but a proportion of it. So what you're looking at here is that on the per hectare basis, when you try to get higher yield by intensifying, you get more nitrate leach from that system exponentially, meaning that you will have probably more than the proportional amount of greenhouse gas emissions from those systems. And that's quite important, because sometimes you still have to emit this exponentially large amount of greenhouse gases because you are short of land. Therefore, the only way to produce enough food is to intensify. But if you have got enough land, then to intensify is not always an option, or not always the solution, excuse me, because by doing that, you are polluting more, disproportionately higher level of the pollutants to the environment. Now, this is the final point of my talk, but when you apply livestock manure rather than the synthetic fertilizers, then even when you have got the same amount of nitrogen given each year for the last 180 years, the fate of the nitrogen or other nutrients and that came into the system were quite different. So when you are looking at the same nitrogen input, the yield is of course lower under the organic plot, and then this is this finding is well known throughout the scientific literature. What we found though is that for the organic plot with cattle manure, the amount that were not used by the crops in that particular year, the majority of them were stored in the soil, and as a result, we observed less NTO emissions, nitrous oxide emissions from that plot compared to the synthetic plot of the equivalent nitrogen input. So again, that means that unless you absolutely have to intensify because you are short of land, it may be better to have a slightly moderate system and whereby you have got the regenerative potential through applying livestock manure. And if you withdraw livestock from the farming systems, you cannot do that. So to conclude here, so we found that the effect of the livestock manure has a very strong impact on the soil fertility and also the long-term resource use efficiency, assuming that you have got enough land, therefore you don't have to overly intensify. What we don't know is that whether these organic matter that we are putting into the system have to be of animal origin, because there are other forms of organic matters, for example, green manure, compost of plant-based food, and so on. And depending on the answer to this question, that would determine whether we could say that without livestock we cannot produce any crops long term, or we cannot say that because then there would be alternative to the livestock manure. We don't know that yet, and we try to work on that now. But for now, it is quite encouraging result here, especially from the livestock industry perspective, that the role of the livestock manure is quite clear in the context of the arable and plant-based systems as well. On that note, I'd like to finish, and I'll be happy to answer any question. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tara. That was a really clear overview of what's clearly a very complicated subject. Lots of ins and outs, and probably a difficult one to be finding a clear answer to, but it sounds like you're heading in that direction. With what you're saying about sort of non-animal derived organic matter, have you got plans to run any trials with different forms of organic matter, or?
No, we're already working with the other forms of the organic matters and of plant origin, but as you know, that the change in soil parameter takes a long time. So basically, the first 5 years, maybe 10 years, you cannot be conclusive about it at all. But what we are observing some difference in the microbial community in the soil. So from there, we might be able to get some hint about the whether that's the case or not. I cannot really tell you what it is likely to be at this stage yet, but we are working on it already.
But certainly for the moment, the value of livestock manure is clear in the results that you have. It's a shame it's not easier to move it around the country.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also the matter of the volume as well. And even if you're able to use compost, and if a compost is only coming from your household, then that's nowhere near enough for the farm operation. And whereas the cattle manure you can produce in bulk. So that is the consideration as well. At the same time, though, from the East Coast perspective, they may not have enough cattle manure. Therefore, you have to transport that from the west, and that's really inefficient with the carbon footprint associated with the transportation as well. Yeah. So you have to make it basically much lighter, and as you know, that technology is being developed elsewhere as well.
Yeah. So another one to sort of watch this space and see what's coming up in the future. It sounds like there's lots more to hear. Well, look, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. It's been great to hear from so many presenters on so many different topics. I hope you've enjoyed it. And certainly for anybody that wasn't able to join us, these recordings will be available on the website in the next couple of days, and we'll be sharing those through social media channels. I would just like to close with a thank you extended particularly to the GrassCheckGB project sponsors. They were a bigger feature in the morning session, but their support has been invaluable to running both of these sessions and the project over the past 3 years and the next 2 or 3 years that we have planned. So just to thank the Red Meat Levy Boards, AHDB, HCC, QMS, our industry sponsors of Cyantech, Germinal, Handley Enterprises, Datamars Livestock, Waitrose and Partners, and then our new project sponsors that have come on board in the last couple of weeks or months, which is Cortiva Agriscience and Morrison's. We're delighted to be working with you as well. Thank you very much to my colleagues at AFBI, the researchers at Rothamsted, and the team at CL that do so much for the project management. But I think we can wrap up there, and just thank you very much for your time.